Okay, the purpose of this lecture is to kind of finish off what we started in class the other day, and that's the discussion of the early Middle Ages. Remember, we talked about some efforts by the Byzantine Empire to reunify the former Roman Empire. We talked about the growth and expansion of Islam, which of course would have a dramatic impact on Europe as well as other regions. And we talked about the phenomenon of evangelization and Christianization, which is about the spread of Christianity. I mentioned that the Franks were this important group, Germanic group, who had established themselves in what was at the time Roman Gaul, as well as parts of what is now Germany. And that under the Merovingian kings, while they consolidated their authority there, these kings were quickly undermined by a lot of the nobles and eventually supplanted by a second dynasty in the 8th century that is historically called the Carolingian dynasty. The most important of these figures in the Carolingian dynasty was Charlemagne. Charlemagne unified most of what had been the Western Roman Empire, with obviously important exceptions. He actually did regain some of the territory in Roman Hispania or the Iberian Peninsula through a campaign into northeastern Spain, but only a tiny bit of that territory. He never made an attempt to cross into the British Isles. He never actually conquered Brittany, which is this little peninsula, off of the kind of sticking off of the western part of France. He did manage to secure hold on most of the territory of Italy, with the exception of southern Italy and Sicily and Sardinia. But his territories extended well into what had been Roman Germania, which is where the German lands were, and of course the Franks were Germanic peoples, right? And so, if you take this map as a whole, ignore the boundaries here, that's a later thing. But you can see the extent of this territory. Charlemagne was even crowned emperor. This was well into his reign, 30 years into his reign. But he was crowned emperor by the Pope. We will talk about this when we discuss Einhard and Notker, which are the sources about Charlemagne. And so we'll come back to some of this. With that consolidation also came sponsorship of education, of intellectual and artistic and cultural endeavor. Frankish education was pretty standardized. A lot of the trends that have been put into place by the Church Fathers, the sort of recommendations they made about, the government of the kingdom and especially of the church, right? Charlemagne got behind all of that, and scholars and political operatives, government officials and things working under him helped to establish these things. Charlemagne, he never had a permanent capital necessarily. He had cities he favored. One of his chief residences, and we might say a kind of capital, was in the city of Aachen, which you can see here is now in northwestern Germany, right on the border almost with the Netherlands or Belgium. I think it's Belgium. But in any case, Aachen he built a palace there, and several churches and other things. And he established a school there, which is called the Palace School. And from the Palace School came a lot of the leading intellectual lights of his day. He was also a great sponsor of monasteries, and helped to bring about a kind of standardization in monastic practice in Europe. And so, because of all of this flurry of intellectual activity going on in the Carolingian period, some scholars have labeled this the Carolingian Renaissance, right? I'm not sure that label is exactly accurate, because I'm not sure that there was ever a death to be a full rebirth, and I'm not sure that what was done in the Carolingian period is really kind of a bringing back. It's more of a continuation in some ways of what had been done by the Church Fathers. But in any case, the creation of this relatively stable, at least for a couple generations, stable empire led to a growth in intellectual activity. But it wasn't to last. The heirs of Charlemagne did not command the kind of authority he did. Things remained mostly stable under his son, Louis. But Louis was Charlemagne's only surviving adult son, by the way, except for an illegitimate son who had rebelled against him. and kind of been removed from inheritance. But Charlemagne's grandsons then were each given, so his son Louis's sons were each given a piece of the empire by the custom of partible inheritance, which we discussed when we talked about the Merovingians. And this led to a lot of fighting, and over the course of the next several generations, you can see the division here that was solidified at the Treaty of Verdun in the year 843. The oldest son, Lothar, and you can see there's a region here called Lotharingia that's named after Lothar. But Lothar took the central region, which was really not very smart of him because he's got enemies, potential enemies on both sides, right? And very quickly this middle kingdom is kind of swallowed up. And we have over here the West Frankish kingdom, and over here the East Frankish kingdom, or West Francia, East Francia. And this quickly becomes a kind of linguistic and political line, right? To the east, people speak what were the early forms of what becomes German, and to the west, people were speaking, Romance languages that would evolve into French and other kind of dialects like Provence and Occitan and these sorts of things. But French more generally, right? Of course, down here they're speaking Italian eventually. This line is a very important historical border between sort of France and Germany, and this ultimately leads to the establishment of these separate kingdoms in those territories, right? And so the Carolingian Empire quickly gets broken up into smaller and smaller units with partible inheritance. I should say that this is, the early Middle Ages is also the period when England is divided up between a number of different kingdoms. The group called the Saxons and another group called the Angles cross the North Sea or cross the English Channel and take control of these territories. England is never unified like the continent was under the Carolingians, right? There are these small kingdoms that are fighting each other fairly constantly. They all eventually convert to Christianity. But because of the instability created by this division of the land, they become easy pickings for people from outside, specifically groups from Scandinavia up here, who we very romantically call the Vikings, right? Which is a term that they use for themselves too, so it's not entirely historically inaccurate. But with the growing instability on the continent, as more and more of these kingdoms are weakened by infighting, by partible inheritance, and then the continued kind of infighting in England. This leads to what some have called the 10th century crisis, right, which sees more or less the collapse of the Carolingian kingdom, the collapse of most of the kingdoms in England, and the growth of the peoples of Scandinavia. They're moving into these areas. They're initially just raiding into England and into the continent, but they eventually establish themselves permanently in places. For instance, the northern part of England was ruled for a century or more by a king whose base was in Denmark. This is the territory called the Danelaw. The only kingdom that was Anglo-Saxon in origin that remained was in southern England. It's the kingdom of Wessex. So there's a lot of instability introduced here. There are even these, Northmen, as they're called often, the Scandinavians, they're Vikings, who set up permanent residences in, what is now northern France, and the region becomes called Normandy after them, right? Norman or Northmen. And one of them wrests from a late Carolingian king the title of Duke of Normandy. I'm making it sound like the Vikings are barbarians, okay? They're really quite a civilized people too in many ways, though they did have a definite warrior ethos that helped to inform their expansion. Groups of these Scandinavians make their way all over the place, right? Some of them are eventually employed as mercenaries by the Byzantine emperors. There's a group of Scandinavians who kind of sets up a kingdom in what is now the Ukraine, specifically in and around the city of Kiev, and they call themselves the Rus, which is actually the origin of the term Russian, but it starts kind of in Ukraine there, and these are people from Scandinavia. And there's another group of Normans who, sails around Iberia into the Mediterranean Sea and eventually takes control of Sicily and southern Italy, right? So these Normans are pretty prolific. They're going a lot of places. And, when the instability of this period eventually settles down, like Europe starts to come into its own, starts to create these more stable kingdoms. But there's this whole period of, I don't want to say chaos exactly, but a lot of different crises. There are renewed Muslim invasions from the south. There are some, nomadic peoples from Central Asia making their way into the eastern borders of what had been the Carolingian Empire. This whole period is sees a good deal of upheaval, right? And so the early Middle Ages comes to a close with all of these crises, and it's not until the 11th century or so that most of these settle down. This period, though, is as Western Europe is lapsing into relative instability. There are a series of rulers in the Byzantine Empire who were quite effective. Most importantly, Basil II, and we'll say more about Basil II when we read Michael Psellus later in the term. But Basil II presides over expansion of the Byzantine Empire into the Balkan Peninsula, into the lands occupied by people speaking Slavic languages. And with the sponsorship of the emperors, Christian missionaries go into these Slavic lands and preach Christianity, and the Slavic peoples go through the same process of evangelization and Christianization that was seen in Western Europe maybe a couple of centuries before. And so Slavic Christianity takes on this Greek Orthodox character, whereas Western Europe becomes Roman Catholic. So those are some of the topics I wanted to cover with the early Middle Ages. Hopefully this serves to solidify some of that in your mind, and we will reapproach a lot of this with our examination with sources later.